She hadn't seen him in 30 years, until one phone call changed everything. When Keanu Reeves heard the trembling voice of his childhood nanny, he canceled everything and boarded a plane. What he found waiting for him would break his heart and unlock a secret she had kept his entire life. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The night was still, the kind of quiet only Los Angeles could offer in its rare, hushed moments. No sirens, no helicopters, just the low hum of the fridge and the soft creak of wooden floorboards in Keanu Reeves's hilltop home. He sat in his study, surrounded by shelves of well-worn books and a dim desk lamp casting golden light across handwritten notes for an upcoming film. A cup of untouched tea had long gone cold at his elbow. For once, his mind wasn't on work. Instead, he found himself lost in the memory of a scene from an old Akira Kurosawa film. One where the hero said nothing, but his silence told the entire story. The silence was broken by a vibration. His phone lit up, screen glowing with an unknown number from New Mexico. Keanu hesitated. At this hour, nearly midnight, calls from unfamiliar numbers were rarely good news. Instinctively, his thumb hovered over decline. But something in the number's area code stirred a feeling. He didn't know why. He pressed answer. "Hello, this is Keanu." For a long breath, there was nothing but a soft rasp of air. Then, a voice, faint, crackling like an old vinyl record, spoke through the line. "Keanu? Is that really you?" He straightened in his chair, the voice striking a chord in a place he hadn't visited in decades. It was aged and fragile, but it carried a softness that he hadn't heard since he was a child. His throat tightened. "Yes, this is Keanu. Who am I speaking to?" A pause, then a trembling sigh. "My name is Lucia Alvarez. I took care of you when you were little, in Toronto. Do you remember me?" Lucia. The name hit him like a punch to the chest. Memories poured in, uninvited. Warm bread pulled from the oven. The hum of lullabies in Spanish. A gentle hand pressing a band-aid to a scraped knee. He could see her again, in the cramped kitchen of their modest apartment, humming while ironing his school uniform. Her silver cross always glinting in the sunlight. The soft "mi niño" she'd whisper when he couldn't sleep. "Lucia," he said, almost to himself. "Of course, I remember you." A small, broken laugh crackled through the line, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone trying not to cry. "I didn't think you would," she said. "I didn't call for anything, not to ask. I just wanted to hear your voice. One last time. Before... I can't anymore." Keanu's heart dropped. He looked at the time again. Midnight in LA meant nearly 1 a.m. in New Mexico. And she was alone, reaching out, not for help, but to say goodbye. "Where are you?" he asked, already standing, already reaching for his keys. "I'm in Santa Rosa," she said softly. "At the Ridgeview home. It's not what it used to be." He didn't say another word, just nodded to no one and began canceling his next 3 days of commitments. As Keanu packed a small overnight bag, his mind spiraled through fragments of a childhood he'd long tucked away. Lucia had been more than a caregiver. She'd been his anchor during years that were anything but stable. When his father was absent and his mother juggled multiple jobs, Lucia was the constant. She taught him how to tie his shoes, kissed his forehead when he had nightmares, and held his hand the first time he asked why his dad didn't come home. And now she was 87, sitting in a failing care facility, calling not to ask for anything, but just to hear his voice. That thought haunted him. He grabbed a sweater, his passport, and a well-worn copy of Letters to a Young Poet, a book she'd once read passages from when he was too restless to sleep. His assistant had texted, concerned about the sudden cancellations, but Keanu simply replied, "Personal emergency, postpone everything." As he headed to the garage, he called his pilot. Santa Rosa, New Mexico, Keanu said. A pause, then, understood. Wheels up in 90. The black SUV cut through the sleeping city like a shadow. As they passed through quiet neighborhoods and empty streets, Keanu stared out the window, seeing not the skyline, but Lucia's face. Not the woman she must be now, weathered by time, but the one he remembered. Smiling, patient, fierce when someone bullied him, soft when he cried. He remembered one particular night. He was maybe 7, maybe 8. He'd been cast in a school play and had gotten sick the night before opening. He'd cried, not from illness, but from disappointment. Lucia had sat beside his bed all night, feeding him spoonfuls of chicken broth and stroking his hair. At some point, she whispered, "Some stars shine later than others, mi amor. But they always shine." At the time, it had sounded like a story. Now, he knew it was a lesson. Arriving at the private hangar, he moved swiftly and quietly, not looking for attention. The plane was fueled and ready. As the jet lifted into the night sky, the lights of Los Angeles vanished beneath them. And Keanu opened his journal. He flipped to a blank page and began to write. Not a speech, not a plan, just words. Words he might say to her. Words he never got to say before she left all those years ago. He didn't know what he'd find in Santa Rosa. He only knew he had to be there, before it was too late. The jet hummed through the upper atmosphere, cutting a quiet path toward New Mexico. Keanu sat still, watching the darkness outside, his reflection ghosted in the window. He thought of the irony. He could cross the world at a moment's notice, but it had taken him 30 years to answer this one call. Sleep wouldn't come, so he replayed Lucia's voice in his head, shaky, faint, but still warm. Still her. She hadn't asked for anything. Not comfort, not help, not even a visit. Just to hear his voice. That humility, unchanged after decades, was what broke him most. She had given so much to him, and now at the end of her road, she expected nothing in return. The plane began its descent just before dawn. The desert below was still cloaked in darkness, but a thin pink line had started to trace the horizon. Keanu watched the colors shift, like a slow promise of something better. Santa Rosa was small, quiet, the kind of town where time didn't move forward so much as stretch. A single nurse met him at the airstrip. She looked surprised when she saw who stepped off the plane, but said nothing, only nodded. He was driven through winding streets until they reached the edge of town. The building came into view. A flat-roofed care home with cracked stucco and a flickering porch light. The sign said Sunset Haven, but it looked more forgotten than peaceful. As they pulled into the lot, Keanu felt his breath catch. What would he say? How would she look? Was he already too late? Inside, the air smelled of bleach and reheated soup. Faded bulletin boards lined the walls, decorated with curling paper flowers from someone's idea of spring. A tired receptionist blinked at him when he entered. He gently said her name. "Lucia Alvarez," he said, voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes widened, recognition flickering across her face. "Room 12, East Wing. She's been up all night, said someone important was coming." Room 12. Every step down that hallway felt heavier than the last. Old memories wrapped around him like fog. Lucia's hands in flour making fresh tortillas. Her laughter in the garden. Her steady grip as he learned to ride a bike. He reached the door and hesitated, then knocked once. A soft voice inside. "Adelante." He turned the handle and stepped into a room where time waited to breathe. Lucia Alvarez had never imagined her life would circle back this way. Not at this age, not under these conditions. At 87, her bones ached constantly. Her eyes blurred quicker than she liked to admit, and her spirit, once so fearless, felt worn thin. She sat alone in her room at the Estrella del Sol Care Center in a small town in New Mexico. The walls were chipped, the air conditioner rattled more than it cooled, and the overhead light flickered with a soft buzz like a dying insect. But what bothered her most wasn't the heat or the peeling linoleum. It was the silence, the kind of silence that stretches across decades and makes a woman wonder if her life left any echo at all. She had crossed a border once, literally and figuratively. Born in Guanajuato, Mexico, Lucia was the second youngest of 7 children and the only one to dream past the dusty roads of her hometown. In her 20s, she followed a neighbor north to work in Toronto, cleaning houses and sending money home. English was hard, the cold was harder. But she never backed down from work. What began as a housekeeping job eventually led her to a family with 2 young children, one of them a boy with jet black hair, almond eyes that always seemed far away, and a last name no one could pronounce right the first time. Keanu. Even then, there was something about him. He didn't speak much at first, just watched her. Not with suspicion, but curiosity. He had questions, always questions, but not the kind most children asked. He wanted to know why people cried when no one was looking, why his father never came back from his long business trips, why his mother smiled in public but locked herself in her room when the door closed. He asked things with his eyes, not his mouth, and Lucia always answered in the way she knew best, through food, gentle hands, and stories. She remembered one winter evening when he had been barely 8 years old, finding him curled up behind the couch with a paperback book he had taken from the school library. He wasn't reading it. He was staring at the cover, a photograph of a man on a stage, lit from above, face twisted in emotion. It was Shakespeare, she realized. Keanu didn't know what it was yet, but she did. That night, Lucia gave him a tattered book from her own collection, An Introduction to Acting, written in simple English, with photos of people expressing joy, rage, grief. "You feel a lot," she'd told him in Spanish. "Don't let that go to waste." He never forgot, and neither did she. Now, decades later, she sat in a room that smelled faintly of bleach and thyme, wondering if the quiet boy she once comforted ever remembered her. She hadn't called to ask for anything. She just wanted to hear his voice one more time. That was enough. Until the knock. Not the nurse, not the doctor, not a social worker with another apology and another bill. Lucia turned slowly in her chair, her hands trembling as she reached for her cane. The door opened, and there he was, Keanu, just standing there. No cameras, no entourage, no red carpet or tailored suit, just jeans, a soft black shirt, and eyes that hadn't changed since the day he first watched her make arroz con leche. Lucia gasped and covered her mouth. Her voice caught, unable to push past the emotion that stormed through her chest. Keanu stepped in slowly. He knelt beside her chair and whispered the only word that mattered. "Lucia." She burst into tears. Lucia's tears came slow at first, then like rain after a long drought. Her small frame trembled as the years folded in on themselves, collapsing the space between now and then. Between the lonely woman in the cracked leather recliner and the boy with big questions and a broken home. Keanu reached for her hand, his touch warm and careful, like he was afraid she might break. "You came," she whispered, still not believing it. "I should have come sooner," he said. "I'm sorry." Lucia shook her head. "No, I didn't want you to come for guilt. I only wanted to hear your voice one more time, to know you were okay. That was enough for me." Keanu didn't speak. He just leaned forward and rested his forehead gently against the back of her hand. That said more than anything. Lucia looked at him again. Really looked. The beard. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He was older, yes, but still had the same quiet gentleness in his presence. Like he didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. His silence was always intentional, filled with thought, with presence. He wasn't a man rushing through life. He was a man who had lived it, every hard-earned moment of it. "I saw you on the news," she said, voice still cracking. "They say you're the kindest man in Hollywood." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's because they haven't seen me when I'm hangry." Lucia chuckled, wiping her cheeks with the corner of her sleeve. You were always funny, even when you didn't talk much. You would sneak jokes into your drawings. Remember the one you did of your father with a banana mustache? Keanu let out a genuine laugh, low and hoarse. Yeah, you put it on the fridge. My mom wasn't happy. I didn't care, Lucia said proudly. You needed to laugh. Her smile faded slightly, her gaze drifting toward the cracked ceiling. You were always watching. Even as a little boy, you saw things other kids didn't, felt things deeper. I always worried the world would be too loud for you, too cruel. Keanu looked around the room. The dented dresser, the broken fan, the thin blanket folded at the end of her bed. This place, Lucia shrugged. It's not much, but it's clean. The nurses try their best. They're just understaffed. There's no money. Most of us are just waiting now. You reach a certain age and people forget. You become invisible. He said nothing for a moment. His jaw tightened just slightly. He didn't like injustice. Never had. Lucia reached for the side table and picked up something wrapped in tissue paper. I kept this, she said, handing it to him. Keanu carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside was a photo. Faded and curled at the edges, it was him, maybe 9 years old, grinning sheepishly with paint on his cheeks. Behind him stood Lucia, smiling, arms crossed proudly. You kept this all these years? He asked. I kept everything, she said softly. You were my joy. Even when things were hard, you gave me something to believe in. Keanu held the photo to his chest for a moment. You believed in me before anyone else did. I still do, she said, and I always will. Keanu placed the photo gently on the table, beside an empty glass of water. The room was quiet, save for the hum of an old air conditioning unit that coughed more than it cooled. He stood and walked toward the window, pulling back the curtain to let in a little more light. Outside, the desert sun baked the parking lot. A sagging fence in the distance leaned toward a dying tree. It was a far cry from the sunlit porch in Toronto, where Lucia used to bring him warm toast and hot tea while he read comic books. I thought about you a lot, Keanu said finally, still gazing out the window, especially when things got hard. Your voice always came back to me. Lucia tilted her head. What did I say? He turned to her. That I didn't have to be loud to be strong, that kindness wasn't weakness, that even if no one noticed, it still mattered. Lucia blinked, holding back fresh tears. You remembered. I built my life on it, he said quietly. A long silence followed, one filled not with awkwardness, but with the deep weight of shared history. Then Keanu crossed the room again and knelt beside her chair. I'm not just here to visit, he said, his voice steady. I came because you matter. Still. Always. Lucia opened her mouth, then closed it. Emotion made her throat too tight for words. I already called my team, he continued. Tomorrow, we're moving you to a better place, a private room, proper care, real dignity. And after that, he paused, smiled gently. You're coming home with me, at least for a while, if you'll let me. Lucia's lips trembled. But Keanu, why? He looked into her eyes. Because I never said thank you, not really. And because love remembers. She wept again, not from pain this time, but from something deeper. Relief. Grace. Keanu sat beside her and held her hand in both of his. The sun moved across the floor in a slow stripe of gold. No more words were needed. Outside, the wind kicked dust across the broken pavement, but inside that cracked room, time itself stood still, reconnecting two hearts that had never truly drifted apart. And somewhere between the silence and the sunlight, something long forgotten was finally made whole. The room was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of bleach and lavender lotion. Keanu stood quietly at the threshold, his eyes scanning the cramped space that Lucia Alvarez now called home. A rusted metal fan buzzed in the corner, trying and failing to push the thick desert air. The cracked tile floor reflected what little light spilled from the window, and a threadbare curtain danced in the slight breeze. But Keanu wasn't looking at the room's decay. His eyes locked onto the framed drawing on the wall above her narrow bed. It was faded, the paper yellowed with age. Crayons had once burst with color, but now the blues and reds had softened into memory. The drawing showed a tall figure with a cardboard crown and a crooked sword, standing proudly beside a woman with braids and a warm smile. In a child's scrawl, it was labeled, "Sir Keanu, Knight of Lucia." He took a step closer, emotion welling in his throat. He remembered that drawing. He must have been 6 or 7. It was the day Lucia had read him a story about a brave knight who protected people not with violence, but with kindness. That night, he told her he wanted to be that kind of knight. And the next morning, he drew that picture and gave it to her. "I didn't think you'd still have it," he said softly, almost to himself. Lucia, lying in her reclined bed, smiled gently through her exhaustion. Her voice was thin but warm. "How could I not keep that?" she whispered. "You were my knight. You still are." Keanu sat in the visitor chair beside her, a creaky plastic thing with a worn cushion. He reached over and gently held her hand. Her fingers were bony and cold, but still carried that quiet steadiness he remembered from his childhood. The same hands that had made him soup when he was sick, or braided his unruly hair when no one else had the time. "I saw the article a few years ago," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "The one about you riding the subway alone, giving up your seat. I smiled so wide, Keanu, because that's the boy I knew. You never changed." He looked away, swallowing hard. "I've done okay," he said quietly, "but I've also missed a lot." Lucia chuckled softly, then coughed. "That's life. We miss things. But you remembered. That's what matters." Then, after a pause, she added, "They told me 6 months, maybe less. The treatments, I said no. Too late. I just wanted one thing." Keanu turned to her, his heart sinking. "I just wanted to see the man the boy became," she said. Her eyes were full of something more powerful than pain, full of pride, of peace. Keanu leaned closer, pressing her hand to his cheek. "You helped make me who I am." And then, without another word, he pulled the blanket up gently over her legs, adjusted the small fan so it hit her face, and settled into the hard visitor chair. He wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. The hours passed slowly. Outside, the buzz of crickets rose and fell beneath the thick silence of the desert night. Inside Lucia's room, only the soft hum of the fan and the occasional creak of old pipes broke the stillness. Keanu sat motionless in the visitor's chair, his long frame awkwardly folded, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He hadn't moved in over an hour. He couldn't. He wouldn't risk waking her. Lucia slept lightly, her breath shallow, uneven. Every few minutes, a soft wheeze escaped her lips, followed by silence, and then, thankfully, the next breath came. Keanu found himself counting them without realizing. It had been decades since he'd last heard her voice, but even now her presence calmed him. Something about her still made the noise of the world feel distant, like when he was 7, hiding under the kitchen table after another loud argument between his parents. Lucia had found him, said nothing, and just slid under the table beside him, her back against the wall, a worn book in hand. She'd read to him for an hour. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't made promises. She'd just stayed. He'd never forgotten that. Now he watched her chest rise and fall, slower with each breath. Her face, though weathered with time and lined with pain, still held the same softness, the same kindness. She had always put others first, always. Keanu shifted in the chair slightly, careful not to make noise. His back ached, and his knees had begun to stiffen. But he didn't care. A part of him felt like that little boy again, afraid to leave her side. Afraid this night might be one of the last. He looked around the room again. There were no luxury blankets or soft pillows. No flowers, just the bare essentials. An old metal dresser, a cracked plastic water pitcher, and a tiny stack of books by the window. On the wall opposite her bed hung a small corkboard with curling photos pinned haphazardly across it. Some were faded Polaroids, others more recent. He got up quietly and walked to it. One picture caught his eye. Lucia in her 30s, standing in front of a snowy porch in Toronto, holding a young Keanu in a bright winter coat. They were both laughing. He remembered that day. The snow had come early, and she'd let him skip school to build a snow fort. His mother had been furious. Lucia had simply smiled and said, "He'll remember the laughter longer than the homework." He still did. Beneath that photo was a note written in Spanish, scrawled in a child's handwriting. He leaned closer to read it. "Gracias por cuidarme cuando nadie más podía. Keanu, thank you for taking care of me when no one else could." He closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. That boy had known even then. Somehow, he'd sensed it. He walked back to her bed and sat again. She stirred, blinking through her sleep. "You're still here?" she murmured. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. Lucia smiled. "Good. I don't like goodbyes in the dark." Keanu squeezed her hand gently. "Then I'll wait for the light." And with that, he settled in again, his eyes never leaving hers, as night folded itself gently around the room. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, bleeding orange and gold through the thin curtains of Lucia's room. Keanu hadn't slept. His eyes were dry, his body stiff, but his mind was sharper than it had been in months. Lucia stirred again. For a moment she seemed confused by the light, blinking at the window, then at Keanu. But when she saw him still sitting in the same chair, her smile returned, tired but real. "You always were a stubborn one," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Keanu chuckled. "Takes one to raise one." Lucia tried to laugh, but it came out as a breathless cough. He poured a little water and held the cup for her. She took a sip with a grateful nod, then leaned back against the pillows. "Did you sleep at all?" "I couldn't, not with you in here all alone." She shook her head gently. "I've been alone a long time, Keanu. It's just, no one noticed before." That line cut deeper than she probably intended. Keanu looked at the cracked walls, the rickety bed frame, the broken-down wheelchair in the corner. She had lived like this, quietly, while the world raced ahead. He ran his hand through his hair and stood, stretching his back. Then he walked to her dresser and picked up the small crayon drawing again. "I remember when I gave you this," he said. "I thought I was protecting you." "You were," Lucia said. "That was the week your parents separated. You heard them fighting, and you thought I was in danger. You said, 'I'll be your knight now.'" Her eyes misted over, though her smile stayed. "You don't know how much I needed that." Keanu held the drawing to his chest. "You don't know how much I needed you." A long silence passed between them, soft, warm, heavy with everything they hadn't said over the years. Then Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'm not letting you spend another night in this place." Lucia frowned. No, Keanu. That's not why I called. I didn't want you to feel..." "This isn't about guilt," he said firmly. "It's about honor. You gave me everything you had when I had nothing. You made a little boy feel safe in a home full of silence. I can't fix everything, Lucia, but I can fix this." Lucia didn't argue. She just reached out and squeezed his hand. Her touch was thin, cool, but steady. "I always knew you'd grow up to do good things," she said. "But this is more than I ever imagined." He looked her in the eyes. "This isn't the good thing, Lucia. You are." Lucia Alvarez sat quietly in her worn recliner, a blanket draped over her knees, as the nurse helped her gather her few belongings into a cardboard box. The air in the care facility was stale again. The air conditioning had given out, and the staff was waiting on another week for repairs. The room was dimly lit, the buzzing overhead light giving everything a tired yellow glow. On her nightstand sat the framed crayon drawing of Keanu as a knight, and, beside it, the old tin of peppermint tea she used to share with him as a boy. She never drank from it anymore. It was mostly empty. But she liked having it close. Just a few days earlier, she had made peace with this place. Cracked tiles, thin soup, and being forgotten. But then Keanu had walked through the door, like a memory with flesh and tears in his eyes. And now, her life was changing again. Only this time, it wasn't terrifying. It was humbling. Lucia looked out the window and saw the sleek black car waiting at the entrance, the driver in a pressed suit with white gloves standing by the door. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Reeves?" the administrator had asked earlier, her voice tinged with both awe and disbelief. "We can have a medical van handle it." But Keanu had simply said, "She's not freight, she's family." Now, as Lucia was wheeled gently out of the only place she'd known for the last 6 years, she passed by residents who watched quietly from their chairs. Some offered nods, others just stared in silence. A few whispered among themselves, wondering what a movie star like Keanu Reeves was doing, walking beside an old woman like Lucia Alvarez. But Keanu didn't care. He carried her bag himself. Not the nurse, not the driver. Him. Lucia looked up at him from her wheelchair, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope this isn't too much trouble." He smiled gently. "It's not trouble, Lucia. It's long overdue." The drive to Los Angeles was quiet, the desert landscape unfurling through the windows as Lucia drifted in and out of sleep. Keanu sat beside her, occasionally glancing her way, making sure the blanket stayed over her knees, adjusting the airflow, making small adjustments with great care. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't take calls. He just sat with her, like he used to when he was a child and she read to him during thunderstorms. When they arrived at the new facility, a private center nestled in a grove of eucalyptus trees, Lucia looked up at the building and blinked. The entrance was lined with flower beds and a small fountain. Birds sang from the trees overhead. A breeze stirred the wind chimes near the door. Her eyes filled with tears. She hadn't seen a place like this in decades. Keanu knelt beside her and took her hand. "Let's go home," he said softly. Lucia's new room wasn't just comfortable, it was familiar. Not because she had been there before, but because it felt like someone had recreated her memories in careful detail. The walls were a soft pastel cream, warmed by the afternoon sunlight that spilled through a large window overlooking a small garden filled with lavender and rosemary. There were no buzzing fluorescents here, only natural light and the faint scent of lemon oil from polished wood furniture. A sturdy oak dresser sat in the corner, topped with a delicate doily and a ceramic lamp shaped like a swan, so similar to the one she had in Toronto when she first arrived from Mexico all those decades ago. But what took her breath away was the little round table set by the window. On it sat a porcelain tea set with tiny hand-painted roses. Lucia reached out with trembling fingers, brushing the rim of one of the cups. This can't be," she murmured, her voice breaking. Keanu was already setting down her small overnight bag beside the closet. He turned, following her gaze. "It's the same set," he said gently, "from the apartment in Toronto. The one we used on Saturdays. I found the maker's mark on an old photo and tracked one down." Lucia covered her mouth with both hands. "But how? Did you remember?" Keanu pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You made chamomile with honey every time I was sick or sad. You always used this set. It stuck." Then she noticed something else. Sitting on a small side table was an old, slightly chipped music box. She let out a gasp. "No. No. It couldn't be." Keanu smiled again. "It's a replica. Yours was long gone, I know, but I remembered the tune. It took a few collectors, but we found it." He wound the tiny key and the melody began. A soft, twinkling lullaby that once played as she rubbed his back during his parents' late-night arguments. as he lay wide-eyed in bed, pretending not to hear them. Lucia wept silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. These weren't just gifts. They were pieces of her past, pieces no one else had ever thought to preserve. She looked around the room slowly. There was even a framed black and white photo on the dresser, a younger version of her holding a book, with a mop-tailed boy at her side. Keanu, at age 7, grinning with a chipped tooth and a face full of mischief. "You remembered everything," she whispered. Keanu leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "You were the first person who ever saw me. Not what I could be, not what I should be, just me." Lucia reached across the table, her hand landing softly on his. "Then maybe, just maybe, I did something right." The room quieted for a moment, the music box playing its final note. Lucia sat back in her chair, overwhelmed but peaceful. She stared out the window where the garden swayed softly in the breeze. It was a stark contrast to the cracked tiles and flickering lights of the place she'd come from. Here time seemed slower, safer, and kind. Keanu stood and walked over to a shelf near the closet. He lifted a small box wrapped in aged ribbon. "One more thing," he said, offering it to her. Lucia untied the ribbon, fingers trembling. Inside was a dog-eared paperback copy of Romeo and Juliet. Its cover almost faded away. Her eyes widened. "This is—" He nodded. "Your copy. The one you gave me when I was 9. I found it in a box I never threw away." Lucia ran her fingers over the worn pages, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. "You used to ask me why Juliet didn't just run away," she said softly. "You always wanted every story to have a better ending." "I still do," Keanu replied. They sat in silence for a while, hands still touching across the table. A nurse knocked gently on the door, breaking the stillness. "Miss Alvarez, would you like your tea now?" Lucia looked at the set by the window and gave a small, teary smile. "Yes, I think I would." The nurse stepped in with grace and familiarity, clearly briefed by someone who cared. She placed the tray gently on the table, pouring the tea without asking for help. A small jar of honey accompanied the cup. Lucia blinked. "Just like I used to do," she whispered. Keanu stayed a little longer. He didn't rush. He didn't check his phone. He simply sat with her as the light changed in the room, casting golden shadows across the carpet. For a man known for his silence, there was something profound in the stillness he shared with her. Before leaving, he knelt by her chair, looked her in the eyes and said, "You're not alone anymore." Lucia squeezed his hand one last time, tears still clinging to her lashes. "I never was I?" Keanu shook his head. Then he stepped out of the room, leaving behind the warmth of memory, the tenderness of reunion, and a promise written in everything he'd done. He remembered, and he always would. The mornings began softly now, no longer filled with the sterile silence of cracked tiles and a failing heater. Lucia's days started with the gentle sounds of the private care home's courtyard, birds nesting in the hedges, the distant splash of a fountain, and the occasional laughter of visiting families. But most mornings, what Lucia waited for wasn't the breeze through the open window or the morning tea placed at her bedside. It was Keanu's knock on the door. He didn't make a grand entrance, never had, always just a soft knock, then the quiet creak of the door. And there he was, wearing his favorite black cap pulled low, carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea from the little cafe across the street. Always the same, just like they used to drink when he was 10 and couldn't sleep. Lucia would pretend to be surprised. "Oh, the night returns." Keanu would smile, only to rescue the queen. They'd laugh together, and she'd pat the chair beside her. Those visits became routine, but never ordinary. Some days they spoke of trivial things, books, old television shows, the nurse who looked like a young Al Pacino. Other days they spoke of nothing at all, just letting silence carry the weight of years. But one morning, Keanu brought something more than tea. A leather-bound notebook, worn edges, pages filled with handwritten memories and thoughts he'd scribbled down over the years. It was his private journal, the one no one had ever seen. Lucia stared at it, her thin hands trembling slightly as she took it. "You wrote all this?" she asked. He nodded. "Some of it's nonsense. Some of it's you." She flipped to a page marked with a dried camellia. The ink was older, faded slightly, but the words were clear. "She saved me, not by doing grand things, just by being the one person who stayed when others left. When I thought silence was the only safe place, she showed me kindness didn't need noise." Lucia's hand went to her chest. "Is that about me?" Keanu just nodded. They sat in silence for a while. The breeze fluttered through the curtains, stirring the pages. That afternoon, Lucia made her own confession, something she had carried for decades, never certain if it was her place to share. "I never told you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "But when you were about 10, your mother was thinking of sending you to a military school." Keanu looked up, puzzled. She thought the structure might help, the discipline. "You were quiet. Too quiet," she thought. "Lost in your drawings." But I told her no. He leaned forward, frowning. "You what?" "I told her if she sent you there, it would crush your gentle soul." Keanu sat back in his chair, stunned into silence. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. He had never known. Lucia watched him carefully. "You were different, Keanu. Sensitive but not weak. You saw things other people didn't, felt things they ignored. The wrong place would have smothered that." He blinked slowly, trying to absorb it all. "I always wondered why she changed her mind. One day she was packing brochures, the next it was just dropped." Lucia smiled softly. "I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just reminded her of who you really were, and who you could become." He looked away, eyes fixed on the rim of his teacup. "I never thanked you." "You didn't have to," she said. But the words still came, quiet and raw. "Thank you." Lucia's eyes filled. Her hands trembled again, but this time not from age. From emotion. "I didn't do it for thanks," she whispered. "I did it because you mattered." Keanu nodded, his voice low. "You didn't just raise me. You saved me." The afternoon sun slid across the floor, warming the edge of Lucia's blanket. The tea between them grew cold, but neither moved. They sat in the stillness, tethered by memory, by truth, by all the words that had waited too long to be spoken. For a moment, Keanu looked younger, not the movie star, not the man known for quiet interviews and kind gestures, just a boy again, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor of a small Toronto apartment, listening to Lucia hum while she folded laundry. He remembered how she used to set out a tiny plate of crackers shaped like stars, claiming it was astronaut food. She'd say, "You'll go far someday, little one, but promise me you'll remember who packed your bag." He had, even if it had taken him years to understand what that meant. Lucia leaned her head back against the pillow, looking out the window. "You know, people always assume children don't notice things, but you saw everything, even when you didn't say a word." "I watched everything," Keanu admitted. "I just didn't know what to do with it back then." She smiled gently. "You figured it out. You've done well." "I tried." "No," she said firmly. "You didn't try. You chose kindness over and over. That's not just luck or instinct. That's soul." Keanu blinked hard. His throat tightened. Lucia reached for his hand, her fingers brushing lightly against his. "I never had children, but when people ask, I tell them I raised a good man." He bowed his head, lips pressed together, trying not to break. The silence was full again, but this time not with distance. It was full of grace. That evening, Keanu stayed longer than usual. They didn't talk much after that. not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had been said already filled the room. Lucia eventually drifted to sleep, with her hand still loosely wrapped around his. He sat beside her, quietly watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the steady hum of the oxygen machine. In the corner, the music box from her youth ticked softly, its lid open, its melody long faded. It didn't matter. The memories were already playing. Keanu's mind wandered back to the worst days of his childhood, the shouting, the cold silences, the nights he stayed awake pretending to read. And always, somewhere in the haze, there was Lucia, holding a book, boiling tea, whispering stories of other places, other lives. She had been the only soft space in a house that often felt like it might shatter. She gave him silence when he needed it, and words when he didn't know how to ask. Now, decades later, she was doing the same again. He took a small notebook from his jacket pocket and scribbled down a few lines, fragments of the moment he didn't want to lose. Not a script, just truth, just her. The nurse peeked in, surprised to see him still there. "She sleeps best when you're here," she said. "I know," Keanu whispered. "So did I." As the night deepened, he sat by the window in the visitor's chair, legs folded beneath him like he had as a boy. He watched the shadows shift on the wall, lulled by the soft breaths coming from the bed. There was a kind of sacredness to the moment. No cameras, no stage lights, just the man and the woman who had saved the boy he used to be. He reached into his pocket again and took out something he'd brought without fully knowing why. A small wooden figure of a knight on a horse. He'd found it years ago at a market in Prague while filming. It reminded him of the drawing he'd once given her, the one she had framed, the one where he was the knight. Now, he placed it gently on her nightstand beside the photo of them together. Him at 7, her in her apron, both of them, grinning like the world was still wide open. As he settled back into the chair, he whispered one last time, "You never stopped fighting for me." Lucia stirred, half asleep, and murmured, "You were always worth it." He closed his eyes and let the quiet hold him. That night, Keanu Reeves, the world-renowned actor known for stoic grace and fierce roles, slept in a modest recliner beside the woman who once stood between him and a life that might have crushed his spirit. He had never needed a spotlight to shine. She had been his light all along. It began quietly, as most things did with Lucia. Claire had come to drop off a fresh box of herbal teas and a few new shawls Keanu had asked her to pick out. Soft, lightweight, in earth tones Lucia always favored. It was mid-morning and the care center was quiet, except for the distant hum of an old radio playing a Frank Sinatra tune near the nurse's station. Lucia was by the window, resting in a recliner with a book on her lap, though her eyes were closed and the book had long since slipped from her fingers. Claire hesitated before entering. She didn't want to disturb the stillness, but something tugged at her. Something about the woman's peaceful expression, the dignity she carried even in frailty. Claire had seen many people come and go in Keanu's orbit over the years. Agents, producers, journalists, distant relatives, but Lucia had a weight that none of them possessed. She didn't orbit around Keanu. She was one of the few people he quietly orbited around. Lucia's eyes opened slowly as Claire stepped in. She smiled faintly, warm but tired. "You again?" Claire chuckled softly and placed the bag on the side table. "Me again. I brought the mint blend you liked, and a few shawls. Thought you might want a change of color." "You're very kind," Lucia said, her voice soft but clear. "But I've never been one for fuss." Claire sat down in the chair across from her and folded her hands in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the chirping of birds just beyond the glass. Then Claire spoke. "I've known Keanu for almost 10 years. I've been in the room when people asked him about his childhood, about who influenced him. He always deflects, always shrugs it off. He's private, you know that." Lucia nodded once. "But recently," Claire continued, "he mentioned you, for the first time. He didn't say much, just your name, and that you were the reason he became who he is." Lucia looked surprised. Not moved, not emotional, just surprised, like someone who had never expected to be remembered at all. "I started thinking," Claire went on. "I've read every article ever written about him. I've helped manage his archives. But your name's not in anything. Not one biography, not one profile. It's like you were never there." Lucia smiled quietly. "That sounds about right." "But you were there," Claire insisted gently. "You were everything when he was young." Lucia sipped from her tea and stared out the window. "I wasn't family," she said after a long pause. "I was just the help. Women like me don't make it into the stories. We're in the margins, doing the things people forget to remember." Claire leaned forward slightly. "But Keanu didn't forget, and I don't think he ever could. That's why I'd like to write something, just for him, a private memoir, not to publish, not for press, just a gift, something that honors what you did, who you are." Lucia's eyes turned toward Claire, thoughtful, unreadable. "He'll need that someday," Claire said. "He deserves the truth. And so do you." Lucia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You can write it, but promise me something. Anything. You don't let him read it until I'm gone." Claire nodded slowly, her voice a whisper. "I promise." Claire returned the next morning with a small voice recorder and a leather-bound journal. Lucia chuckled softly when she saw the tools laid out on the side table, her fingers grazing the journal's cover like it was a relic from another life. "I've never been interviewed before," she murmured, amusement dancing behind her tired eyes. "Are you sure I'm interesting enough for all this?" Claire gave her a warm smile. "You shaped a child who grew up to shape millions. I think that makes you more than interesting." They started slowly. Lucia insisted on making tea herself, even though the care staff offered. She said the ritual mattered. She placed the cups on the small tray herself, using the same slow, deliberate grace she'd once used setting dinner at Keanu's childhood home. Claire noticed her hands trembled slightly now, but she never asked for help. Lucia began by telling her story not as a nanny, but as a girl. "I came to Canada when I was barely 20, she said, her voice drifting into the past. "From a small village in Veracruz. My older cousin had moved to Toronto for work, and she told me I could find a better life there. I didn't speak much English, just enough to ask for the time or buy a loaf of bread, but I learned." She paused, sipping her tea. "My first job was cleaning office buildings at night. Then I was offered a live-in position with a family. That's how I ended up in the Reeves household." "Your boss," she said with a small laugh, "was just 5 years old. Quiet. Too quiet." Claire listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in the journal. "His parents were busy, always somewhere else, but Keanu, he lived in his own head. He would sit for hours drawing things. Dinosaurs, airplanes, castles. He used to line up his toys in rows. Never played with them, just arranged them like they were characters on a stage." "Did he talk to you?" Claire asked softly. Lucia nodded. "At night. That was our time. When the house was quiet and he couldn't sleep, he'd come find me. We'd sit in the kitchen. I'd make cinnamon toast. He'd ask questions. About everything. Why the moon follows us. Why people cry. Why grown-ups yell when they're scared." Her voice cracked slightly. "It was 5, Claire. 5, and already he carried more weight than most adults. He didn't just want answers. He wanted to understand them, to hold the truth in his hands." Claire's heart ached at the image of the boy who would become Keanu Reeves, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, whispering questions into the night. "Did you ever feel like family?" she asked gently. Lucia smiled, her gaze distant. "He made me feel like I was, even if the world never did." Claire reached forward and clicked off the recorder. For now, that was enough. But Lucia had more stories to tell. And the truth, the real truth, was only just beginning to unfold. The next afternoon, Claire returned with fresh pages printed and tucked into a folder. Lucia had asked her to read back what they'd recorded the day before, curious how her words would sound once lifted from memory and placed on the page. Claire began to read aloud, softly, reverently. She smelled like sugar toast and safety, Claire read from the page. She moved through the house like a guardian in silence, and when my world felt too big, she made it feel small enough to breathe in. Lucia blinked, then smiled in disbelief. "That's from him?" Claire looked up. "It's from a journal Keanu wrote in his 20s. He never showed it to anyone, but I found it while researching this piece. I think you lived in his heart longer than you realized." Lucia's eyes welled. "I didn't need him to remember me. I only needed him to be okay." Claire paused, hesitant. "Would you like to leave him a letter?" Lucia sat still for a long time, her hands folded on her lap. Finally, she nodded. "Yes. But he can't read it until I'm gone. Promise me that." "I promise." That evening, Lucia took a small sheet of cream paper and a fountain pen Claire had left for her. In her handwriting, slow, elegant, and slightly slanted, she began to write. By morning, the envelope was sealed and resting beneath the music box on her dresser. It simply read, "For Keanu. When it's time." The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the care facility, casting a gentle glow across the tiled hallway. It was quiet save for the soft shuffle of slippers and the distant hum of a vacuum. But today there was something different in the air, a quiet buzz of anticipation that even the nurses couldn't hide. At the end of the corridor, a freshly painted sign gleamed in gold letters, "The Rose Room." Keanu stood outside the room, hands in his pockets, heart steady but full. He'd spent weeks working on this, going over every detail with the architects, the designers, the gardeners. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about meaning, memory, respect. Inside, the space had been transformed. On one side was a modest reading nook, lined with bookshelves of carefully selected titles, classics, poetry, history, and Spanish novels. There was a soft armchair near the window, the exact shade of deep plum Lucia had once mentioned liking in a long-ago conversation. A woven basket of shawls sat beside it, warm and neatly folded. On the other side was something simpler, and somehow more powerful. A small indoor garden, flooded with natural light, filled with soft greenery and delicate pink roses. The roses were the centerpiece. They had to be, because they were the same variety Lucia used to grow in the backyard of Keanu's childhood home in Toronto. He remembered the smell, the color, the way she'd talked to the plants like they were children, gently, with a smile. He remembered once, after a particularly bad day at school, she'd met him at the door with a rose tucked behind her ear and a slice of cinnamon bread in her hand. He hadn't said a word, just collapsed into her arms. She hadn't asked for an explanation. She never did. Now, decades later, those same roses, Lucia's roses, as the staff had begun calling them, filled the air with a quiet sweetness. Their petals opened gently toward the sunlight, a soft defiance against time and pain. Claire stepped beside him, holding a small pair of scissors wrapped in ribbon. "They're ready," she said quietly. "Everyone's seated." He nodded. Lucia had been wheeled in a few moments earlier. The staff had kept her in the dark about what the room was for, only telling her there was a special event and she was the guest of honor. Now she sat near the center, flanked by fellow residents and nurses, her silver hair combed back neatly, a shawl resting on her shoulders. She was tired, but alert, and something about her eyes. They were scanning the room, searching for something, like she felt it before she knew it. Keanu walked in slowly, his presence met with polite applause. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he crouched beside Lucia's wheelchair and whispered, "It's your room." She blinked. "What?" He smiled. "Come see." Lucia reached for his arm, her voice small but steady. "Keanu, what have you done?" He guided her forward gently as the crowd parted around them. She took in the roses first, of course she did. Her fingers twitched slightly as she saw them, as if her body remembered the rhythm of pruning and watering. Then her eyes moved to the books, the window seat, the hand-painted mural on the back wall, a scene of a simple garden with a small boy sitting beside a woman on a bench, a book open between them. Lucia stopped moving. Her breath caught. Tears welled up instantly. "You remembered?" she whispered. Keanu leaned down. "Every single thing." Lucia sat in silence as Keanu wheeled her closer to the roses. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly, and cupped the soft bloom of a newly opened pink blossom. Her fingers brushed over its petals with reverence, and for a moment, she was young again, kneeling in a garden in Toronto, dirt under her fingernails, the sun warming her back. "These are Rosa New Dawn," she murmured, her voice fragile with awe. "I haven't seen this variety in decades." Keanu nodded gently. "You told me once they were your favorite. I asked a gardener to help find the exact one. We tracked them down in British Columbia." Lucia blinked, a soft laugh escaping through her tears. "You really remembered?" "I remember everything," he said quietly. A nurse brought over a small teacup, porcelain with a faded pink rim, and handed it to Lucia with a smile. The cup matched the old tea set they used to use in the kitchen after school, the one she'd saved for special occasions like birthdays and heartbreaks. Lucia stared at it for a long time, her eyes wide. "This?" "I kept one," Keanu replied, setting another cup on the nearby side table. "It was cracked, but I never threw it away." Lucia didn't speak. She simply pressed the teacup to her lips as if it were made of gold. Around them, the small crowd of staff, residents, and a few discreet members of Keanu's team watched in quiet respect. There were no press cameras, no media attention, just the people who mattered, present in a moment that was bigger than any headline. Claire stepped forward to announce the dedication. "We're honored to open this new space today," she said, her voice calm and warm. "It will serve as both a reading room and a garden for all residents to enjoy. But it's more than just a room. It's a tribute to someone who quietly shaped a life, someone whose impact was never listed in magazines or interviews, but is deeply rooted in the heart of one man who never forgot." She turned to Lucia, who was still gazing at the roses with quiet wonder. "Lucia Alvarez, this is the Rose Room, named after your flowers and your love." The crowd applauded gently. A few residents wiped at their cheeks. A caregiver in the back clapped, with a tissue in hand, overcome. Lucia's chin quivered as she turned to Keanu. "I never thought anyone would remember the flowers I planted. Not really." Keanu knelt beside her once more, placing a hand over hers. "You didn't just plant flowers, you planted peace. You planted hope, and I think the world could use more of both." Lucia stared at him, her eyes shining with the quiet pride of someone who never asked for recognition, but finally received it, not in applause, but in understanding. And that, for her, was everything. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a memory she didn't know she still carried. As the guests mingled and tea was poured, Lucia found herself surrounded by faces that had only ever known her as a quiet resident. Until now. A woman in her early 70s, wearing a pale yellow sweater, sat beside her. "I used to be a florist," she said softly. "When I saw the garden, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Hope." "Thank you." Lucia's hand hovered over her chest. "I didn't do this." "You did," the woman smiled, "because someone loved you enough to show the rest of us what that looks like." By sunset, the Rose Room glowed with amber light. Keanu helped Lucia out of her wheelchair and into a cushioned rocker by the tall window. The roses were silhouetted by the fading sun, their petals catching the final blush of the day. She exhaled deeply. "I never thought I'd see something like this again." Keanu sat beside her, legs crossed, hands in his lap. "When you took care of me, you never asked for anything. Not praise, not thanks, just a safe place to be. This is just giving that back." Lucia looked around slowly, the shelves lined with large print books, the music softly playing in the background. The walls painted a color she once described as sunlight trapped in paint. She smiled, faint but radiant. "You remembered it all?" Keanu turned toward her, eyes glinting. "I couldn't forget it, Lucia. You taught me the world wasn't just noise, that silence, kindness, and care matter most." She reached out and took his hand, frail but steady. "I worried, that when I left, I'd disappear from your story." "You were never just a part of the story," he said. "You were the reason I kept going when it didn't make sense to." Lucia's eyes closed briefly as her head rested back into the chair. The soft hum of life buzzed around them, laughter in the hallway, the chirp of birds in the garden, the shuffle of feet on polished floors. It was all so beautifully ordinary. Then she whispered so softly he almost didn't catch it, "Now I understand. This room, this garden, this isn't just a gift." Keanu leaned closer. "It's proof I was never invisible." And with that, the rose room bloomed, not just with flowers, but with everything Lucia had once quietly sown into a boy who grew up remembering the hands that helped raise him. Word traveled slowly through the care facility at first, like a quiet ripple spreading across a still lake. At Meadow Grove Center, most residents were used to routines, to familiar rhythms that rarely changed. But ever since Lucia Alvarez moved in, something felt different. It began with the staff noticing the visits, not the usual ones that came and went like clockwork. These were different. A man arrived in a plain baseball cap and sunglasses, humble, quiet, never drawing attention. But he didn't just visit, he stayed. He laughed, he listened, he brought books, he fixed things, he rolled up his sleeves and poured tea with trembling hands when Lucia couldn't. For a while no one asked who he was, perhaps out of respect, perhaps because, in a place where so many people were used to being overlooked, no one wanted to risk chasing away someone who actually showed up. But people whispered. They wondered. It was Julia, one of the night nurses, who finally noticed the truth, or rather, pieced it together. She'd been tucking in a resident near Lucia's room when she overheard Lucia laughing softly. "Keanu, you still take your tea with too much honey. I warned you as a boy it would rot your teeth." And the voice that answered, though gentle and quiet, made Julia freeze. It was unmistakable. She tiptoed away, phone clutched in hand, heart pounding in her chest. Keanu Reeves. Could it really be? Julia didn't tell anyone at first. But the next morning, she took a photo. Nothing invasive, just a moment when Lucia and Keanu sat under the blooming rose trellis in the garden he'd helped build. Lucia's hand was on his wrist, and he was leaning close, listening intently to her. The tenderness in the image said more than any caption could. That evening, Julia posted the image anonymously in a small online forum for caregivers, writing only, "This woman used to care for a little boy no one thought would amount to much. She believed in him when no one else did. He grew up and never forgot her. Today, he visits her every day in our care home. Kindness is real. So is gratitude." She didn't tag him, didn't even say his name. But the internet has a way of filling in the blanks. Within 24 hours, the photo had been shared over 40,000 times. By the third day, it had gone viral. Headlines began to pop up on entertainment blogs and inspirational news outlets. Hollywood star quietly honors his childhood nanny. Keanu Reeves' secret visits melt hearts across the internet. Who is Lucia Alvarez, the woman behind the man? None of it had been authorized. Not by Keanu, not by Lucia. At first, she didn't know. She didn't have social media. But the nurses began acting different, more affectionate. The activities director asked if she'd like to lead a storytelling circle. A group of volunteers arrived unexpectedly with flowers and blankets, saying they'd been inspired by a story they'd seen online. Lucia was confused. until Claire arrived with her phone open to the post. "Lucia, I think you should see this." Lucia stared at the phone screen, squinting through her reading glasses. The image of her and Keanu beneath the roses filled the frame. She looked peaceful, happy, older, of course, but undeniably herself. And there he was beside her, head slightly bowed, as if listening to a sacred story. Her fingers hovered above the glass, trembling slightly. She didn't speak for a long moment. Claire waited, her expression unreadable. Finally, Lucia whispered, "Why would someone post this?" Claire's voice was soft. "They didn't mean harm. One of the nurses, I think she just wanted to share something beautiful." Lucia handed the phone back slowly, her shoulders sagging. "But this wasn't meant for the world." "I know," Claire said gently, "and I already contacted the platform. The post wasn't meant to go viral. It didn't even mention your names. But people figured it out." Lucia looked toward the window, where sunlight streamed across the quilt Keanu had brought her. Her voice grew smaller. "I didn't want to be seen like this, not sick, not like a symbol. I just wanted to slip away quietly." Claire crouched down beside her. "You may not have asked for this, but people aren't reacting to your illness, Lucia. They're responding to your life, to your heart, to the way you showed up for someone and how he's showing up for you now." Tears welled in Lucia's eyes. "It was never about being noticed. I was just doing my job." Claire shook her head. "You weren't just the help. You were everything to him." That night, Keanu visited as usual, unaware of the online storm. He walked in carrying a small box. He'd found an old Polaroid of them from when he was 9, one of the few photos that had survived his mother's many moves. In it, he was wearing a paper crown Lucia had made, standing on a milk crate like a stage. She was behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, smiling as if the whole world was in that moment. He handed it to her. "I thought you might want to keep this in the rose room." Lucia smiled through her tears. "Keanu, something's happened." She told him about the photo, the caption, the shares, about the volunteers, the flowers, the new visitors at the home asking about her, about how people were now calling her the nanny who raised a legend. Keanu grew quiet. He sat beside her in the cushioned chair he'd practically claimed as his own. He folded his hands, then looked up. "Do you want me to stop it?" Lucia blinked. "Can you? I can make a call, get it taken down, issue a statement. People will move on in a week. Or I can do nothing." She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, don't hide it. Just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't speak for me. Let me be seen. Just once, but on my own terms." Keanu nodded slowly. "You deserve to be known, Lucia. You always did." He reached over and gently squeezed her hand, his voice steady but warm. "You didn't raise me to stay quiet. Not when it matters." Lucia smiled faintly, then whispered, "Then let them see who I really am." Lucia Alvarez sat by the large window in her new care home, a soft knitted shawl around her shoulders and a teacup resting quietly in her lap. The sunlight filtered through the rose vines growing along the trellis outside the rose room, casting gentle patterns on the floor. She had grown used to the serenity of this place, to the routine, to the quiet respect she was shown. Yet today felt different. There was a ripple in the stillness. That ripple came in the form of Claire, Keanu's assistant, her polite knock tapping lightly against the open door. "Lucia," she said with a smile. "There's someone who'd like to speak with you if you're open to it." Lucia raised a brow. "Who?" "Her name is Lena Tran. She's a journalist. She read about the Rose Room and—" She connected the dots. Claire hesitated. "She wants to write about you." Lucia's heart skipped, not with fear, but resistance. "No," she said quietly. "No, thank you." Claire nodded gently, as if expecting the answer. "That's okay. I told her you might not be interested. I just wanted to ask." She stepped back, prepared to leave. But then came a small voice from across the room. "Tia?" It was Olivia, her great niece, who had been visiting for the afternoon. The young woman, barely 20, with dark curls and a quiet strength in her eyes, walked to Lucia's side and sat on the edge of the window seat. "Can I say something?" Lucia turned. "Of course. I think you should do it." Lucia frowned. "Why? So people can write about Keanu again? So they can stare at me like I'm some piece of trivia from his past?" "No," Olivia said softly. "So they can see you, all the other women like you, all the people who give and no one ever knows their names." She reached out, gently taking Lucia's hand. "You always said the quiet ones make the biggest difference. Maybe it's time someone said that out loud." Lucia looked out the window again. The roses were blooming, a soft coral pink against the green. She thought of her mother, who scrubbed other people's floors until her hands cracked. She thought of her sisters, who raised other people's children without ever being called mama. She thought of all the women who slipped through history, doing the work, leaving no signature behind. Maybe Olivia was right. Lucia sighed. "But only on my terms." Claire turned back, her expression lighting up. "What would those be?" Lucia spoke slowly. "This story is not about Keanu. It's about caregivers, about people who love without needing credit. And it should be written that way, or not at all." "I'll tell Lena," Claire said, already pulling out her phone. "She'll understand. And she'll be honored." Lucia nodded. "Then I'll speak." The next afternoon, Lena Tran arrived with a notebook, a quiet smile, and a promise not to press. She was younger than Lucia had imagined, early 30s maybe, with a calm presence that instantly made the room feel less like an interview and more like a conversation between old friends. Lucia sat upright in her chair, hands folded in her lap, her tea untouched. "You know," she began, "I only agreed to this because I want people to understand something." Lena nodded. "I'm here to listen." "I wasn't family," Lucia said plainly. "I wasn't even really staff, not the kind you'd find in a film credit or a memoir. I was just there, quiet, a shadow in the background." Her eyes searched the window, but her thoughts were far away. "But I loved him, and I fought for him. That matters, doesn't it?" "It matters," Lena said quietly, scribbling nothing for a moment, just letting the moment hang in the air. Lucia took a deep breath. "When Keanu was young, he was so quiet. People mistook that for weakness. But I knew better. There was steel beneath the silence, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that lasts." "Tell me about the day you met him," Lena asked gently. Lucia smiled. "He was 5. He hid behind the curtain and watched me mop the floors. He didn't speak at first, just watched. The next day he brought me a cookie from the kitchen and said, 'My name is Keanu. You work too hard.'" She chuckled. "I told him, hard work was what made you strong." Lucia's stories flowed gently. She spoke of quiet meals on rainy afternoons, how Keanu would read aloud from worn books she brought from the library, his voice trembling with every new word. She described the time he fell from a tree and refused to cry because, as he said, "I'm trying to be brave like you." But she also spoke of the behind-the-scenes battles, the ones no child ever hears about. The time Keanu's parents discussed sending him to a military boarding school, worried he was too sensitive, too odd. How Lucia had stood her ground, had begged, reasoned, even threatened to quit if they followed through. "You'll break him," she'd warned, "and once he's broken, you won't know how to put him back together." "They didn't listen to many people back then," she added, her voice soft. "But that time, they listened to me." Lena blinked, visibly moved. "You changed the entire course of his life?" Lucia waved a hand dismissively. "I just kept the wind at his back. That's what caregivers do." The interview ended 2 hours later, though the conversation could have lasted days. Lena hugged Lucia before leaving and promised, again, that the story would be written exactly as she asked. No spotlight, no sensationalism, just truth. Lucia sat quietly as the door closed behind her. "Let the world see," she whispered, "but only what matters." 3 days later, the article went live under the title, "The Woman Who Saved Keanu Reeves." But it wasn't really about Keanu. Not entirely. Lena's words painted Lucia not as a servant or a footnote, but as a quiet force behind one of Hollywood's most beloved actors. The piece celebrated her defiance, her tenderness, her silent strength. More importantly, it spotlighted thousands of caregivers like her, unseen, uncredited, but vital. The internet reacted swiftly. Comments poured in. "My grandma was the Lucia in my life. I'm crying. Every caregiver deserves this kind of recognition. This incredible woman reminds us all what real love looks like." Lucia didn't say much when she saw the story. She just stared at the photo of her younger self Lena had found, smiling, holding a book next to a small boy with dark eyes and shy hands. When Keanu visited that evening, he found her sitting beside a vase of fresh roses, tears in her eyes. "They know now," she whispered. Keanu knelt beside her, eyes gentle. "They should have known all along." She took his hand, the same way she had when he was 5. "I never wanted to be famous," she said, "just remembered." The envelope was unremarkable, plain white, slightly bent at the corners. But the moment Lucia Alvarez pressed it into Keanu's hand, it carried the weight of a lifetime. "Don't open it until I'm gone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu hesitated, eyes scanning her face. Lucia's skin had grown more translucent these past few days, like parchment touched by time. Her grip, though frail, still carried purpose. She was serious. "I mean it," she added, a flicker of her old strength dancing in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "I promise." Lucia let go of the letter, her hand falling gently onto the crocheted blanket that covered her lap. It was one of her own, from years ago. She still remembered the pattern by heart. Keanu tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket without looking at it again. He didn't need to. The weight of it pressed against his chest in a way that told him it would be unforgettable. That night, Keanu sat beside her longer than usual. She had grown quieter, sleeping more often than speaking. The staff at the private care home were kind, attentive, but there was a hush in the way they moved now, a collective sense that something precious was drawing close to its end. When she stirred, Keanu took her hand and whispered, "Is there anything you need, Lucia?" She opened her eyes, smiled softly, and said, "Music." It was all she said. The next day, a glossy black baby grand piano arrived at the care home. Delivered without fanfare, nestled in the main common room, where residents sometimes read or played cards. It was the same model Keanu had learned to play on, long ago, in the quiet hours when his world had no words, only notes. He brought his own stool, wore a soft gray sweater, and when he sat at the keys, his back straight and his fingers poised, the room fell into a reverent hush. He played Clair de Lune first, then an old lullaby Lucia used to hum when he couldn't sleep, and finally, a tune he composed himself. Something simple, melodic, written just for her. Lucia cried through the entire last piece. Not loudly, just a steady, silent stream of tears slipping down her cheeks, like the past was letting go of her one memory at a time. Across the room, Olivia, her great niece, watched with one hand over her heart. She had grown close to Lucia in these recent months, often visiting after school or on weekends. She had her phone in her hand, trembling slightly. Lucia noticed and nodded. Olivia whispered, "Are you sure?" Lucia nodded again, more firmly this time. So Olivia recorded the last piece, Keanu playing, head bowed, while Lucia listened from her wheelchair, hand over her heart, eyes brimming with gratitude. She posted it later that night with a caption that simply read, "For the woman who raised him, she asked me to share it." By morning, the video had over 1 million views. Olivia stared at her phone in disbelief. The comments poured in, thousands of them. People from all over the world wrote things like, "I've never cried so hard at a piano. This woman's face, That's love. I don't even like classical music, but this touched something deep in me. Others wanted to know who she was. The woman in the chair. The woman who sat with silent pride while a world-famous actor played a private concert just for her. And then someone reposted a clip from the article. The woman who saved Keanu Reeves. The pieces came together. Strangers across the internet began sharing their own stories about caregivers, grandparents, the ones who raised them without fanfare or applause. Keanu was silent on social media. He said nothing to the press. But that afternoon, he brought Lucia a newspaper folded neatly in half. On the front page was a still from the video. Keanu at the piano, Lucia in profile, her face lit by the soft amber of afternoon light. They printed this, he said, setting it in her lap. But you already knew it wasn't just a song. Lucia studied the image for a long time. No makeup, she muttered dryly, then laughed a little. I look like an old ghost. You look like my whole childhood, Keanu said gently. She didn't reply. She just leaned her head back against the cushion and closed her eyes, the paper resting in her lap like an offering. The sun warmed her arms. Her hands, still elegant despite the years, lay folded gently together. Later, she whispered, promise me something. Anything, Keanu said. When I'm gone, and people ask, don't make it about me. He frowned. What do you mean? Make it about the forgotten ones, the other Lucias, the ones no one visits, the ones who still wait by the phone, hoping a child they helped raise remembers their name. Keanu nodded slowly. I will. She smiled again. You always listened more than you talked. That's what I liked about you. That night, Olivia told him, she's not afraid, but I think she's getting ready. Keanu sat in the hallway outside Lucia's room for a long time after that. The hallway smelled faintly of roses. Someone had left fresh flowers on a table nearby, the same kind Lucia used to grow behind their old house in Toronto, the same she once showed him how to care for, one thorny stem at a time. He hadn't opened the letter, he still wouldn't, but he touched the pocket where it rested and whispered, not yet. That night, as rain gently tapped the windows, Lucia whispered to Olivia, I've lived enough. She smiled once more and fell asleep with peace in her eyes. The morning air was soft and cool, the kind that hinted at spring's arrival even before the blooms showed themselves. Lucia sat wrapped in a pale shawl, her frame more delicate than ever, but her voice still held its quiet authority. I want to see where the children go, she said softly. The place you built. Keanu, seated beside her, looked up from the garden sketch pad they'd been playing with for weeks. You mean the shelter? She nodded. You told me once it was where you planted hope for those with no one. I want to see it. Maybe plant something there. Keanu smiled gently, understanding. Then we'll go. By noon the next day, Lucia's wheelchair was carefully loaded into the van Claire had arranged, and they began their drive to the hills just outside Los Angeles. The children's shelter sat on a quiet slope overlooking the valley, modest, sunlit, alive with laughter in the afternoons. Keanu had helped fund it anonymously for years. It was a place where kids from fractured homes, or none at all, could find stability, food, education, and love. Lucia's eyes widened as they pulled into the circular drive. You never told me it was this beautiful. You never asked, Keanu said softly. But I always hoped someday you'd see it. Claire met them at the entrance and wheeled Lucia around the side where a patch of open land waited, bare earth under a clean sky. It was here that Keanu had been saving space for something special, something he hadn't named until Lucia asked to come. This is where it goes, he said. Whatever you want to grow here. Lucia looked out at the space and was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. We'll need rosemary. It's for memory. Keanu nodded. And lavender? Healing, she said, voice almost a whisper. And white roses. New beginnings. Claire took notes quietly, her eyes misting as she listened. She had seen Keanu do many extraordinary things over the years, but this gentle project, born from love and memory, might have been the most human. Lucia supervised everything from her chair, insisting on staying through every decision. A landscaper came with samples of soil and flower trays, but Lucia waved off the catalogs and pointed instead to the hand-drawn sketches she'd made with Keanu the week before. She was frail, but her memory was unshakable. She remembered how sunlight would fall across a bench at 3 in the afternoon. She knew exactly where the wind would be gentlest for the jasmine vines. "I want the children to feel safe here," she said, "like the world hasn't forgotten them." When one of the boys at the shelter wandered by, curiosity getting the better of him, he pointed at the open plot. "What's this for?" Lucia smiled. "For you." The boy blinked. "For me?" "For all of you," Keanu added, kneeling beside him. "So when things feel hard, you can come here and feel peace." The boy didn't respond at first. Then he said quietly, "Can I help plant it?" Lucia nodded with a smile so tender it made Claire look away for a second, hiding the tears. "Of course, mijo. That would mean everything to me." Over the next week, the garden slowly took form. Keanu cleared his schedule entirely. He arrived each morning before sunrise and stayed until the moon peeked over the hills. Children came in shifts, hands covered in dirt, laughter echoing through the courtyard. They called Lucia Abuela, grandmother, as if they'd known her all their lives. And somehow, they had. Her spirit, her way of listening, of noticing, of loving without needing credit, was familiar, especially to the ones who had known too little of it. Lucia didn't need to stand or move fast. She simply sat in the middle of it all, offering direction with a glance or a soft word, watching the colors and textures blend into something beautiful, something alive, something that would last beyond her. The day the final stone was laid, the entire shelter gathered. Staff, children, a few donors, no press. That was Keanu's request. This was for Lucia, for the givers who never asked for anything in return. The air was warm, touched with a scent of rosemary and lavender. A small trellis wrapped in white flowering vines stood at the garden's edge. Beneath it, a bronze plaque had been installed. Lucia hadn't asked for one. Keanu insisted. It read, "For the ones who gave without needing applause." Lucia stared at it for a long time. Her hand reached out, fingers trembling slightly. She traced each word as if they were etched in her bones. She didn't speak for several minutes. Then, softly, she said, "That's more than I ever dreamed." Keanu knelt beside her. "You deserve so much more." She shook her head. "I didn't do it to be remembered. I did it because you were a child who needed kindness." "And because of that," Keanu replied, voice thick with emotion, "I learned what it meant to be human." The children began singing, a soft chorus they'd practiced with their music teacher. Lucia listened with closed eyes. Her great-niece Olivia stood behind her, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. Claire snapped a photo, quietly, capturing a moment no one wanted to forget. When the music faded, Lucia opened her eyes. "Now," she whispered, "I can rest." Keanu stayed with her long after the others left. They sat in silence, side by side, looking at the roses they had planted together. Hummingbirds darted through the sunbeams. Wind rustled the leaves. It was quiet, but full. Lucia leaned against the side of her chair, eyes heavy but peaceful. "Promise me something." "Anything," Keanu said. "Keep planting gardens, even if I'm not here, even if no one knows why." He smiled faintly, taking her hand. "I promise." And as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting golden light across the garden, Keanu realized something. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The late afternoon sun cast soft shadows across Lucia Alvarez's quiet room. The air was still, almost reverent, as if time itself had slowed to honor her presence. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the care center's garden, carrying the faint scent of lavender and rosemary, plants she'd helped pick for the children's shelter just weeks before. Inside, the only sound was the steady, gentle rhythm of Keanu Reeves's fingers brushing across Lucia's hand. She had been sleeping more lately, eating less, speaking in whispers. Her once animated voice full of warmth and wit had grown faint. But her eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes that had once read stories to a lonely boy under a blanket fort, still carried light when they opened. Now they were closed, peaceful. Olivia sat on the other side of the bed, holding her great-aunt's other hand, silent except for the soft hum of an old lullaby she remembered Lucia singing when she was small. The doctors had said it could be any time, and so Keanu stayed. He canceled his filming schedule, left meetings behind, moved into the room next door. Some people called it devotion. To him, it was simply right. He didn't want her to go alone. That morning, Lucia had stirred only once. Her lips had parted, breath shallow, to say a single word. Light. Keanu had leaned close, unsure if she meant the light from the window or the one she'd always carried inside her. Olivia had whispered, "She's ready." As twilight began to fall, Lucia's breathing grew slower, softer, until, with one final exhale, it stopped. There was no panic, no rush of alarms, just stillness. Keanu bowed his head, tears gathering but not falling yet. Olivia pressed her lips to Lucia's hand, then laid it gently over her chest. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Keanu whispered, "Thank you." He didn't mean just for the years of care. He meant for everything. For standing in when his world was falling apart. For giving without expecting anything in return. For never letting him forget where his roots were planted. A few days later, under a wide sky and surrounded by people who had come to know the real Lucia Alvarez, her funeral was held in a small chapel just outside Los Angeles. Keanu had requested it be private. No press, no headlines. Only those who mattered. The room filled with nurses, care workers, children from the shelter, and friends who had grown close during her final season of life. Some knew her from her viral story, others only from how she made them feel. Safe, heard, important. At the front of the chapel sat a simple wooden box, polished but plain. On top of it lay a folded linen handkerchief with delicate embroidery, a rose. Beside it, a sealed envelope marked, "To Keanu. Read only when I'm gone." He picked it up with trembling hands. "I haven't read this yet," Keanu said, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the emotion beneath. "Lucia gave it to me weeks ago. I promised I'd read it when the time was right." He looked out across the gathered faces. Then he unfolded the paper. Keanu unfolded the letter with slow care, as if each crease carried weight. The paper was soft from age, slightly yellowed. Her handwriting flowed in graceful loops. Elegant, old-fashioned, unmistakably Lucia. He took a breath and began to read aloud. "My dear Keanu, if you are reading this, then my time in this world has quietly slipped away. Please don't be sad. My life has been long, and though not always easy, it has been full of meaning. When I came to care for you, I didn't know how deeply a child could change me. I was hired to cook and clean, to supervise, but what I found in you was something else. A soul I recognized. You were quiet, yes, but inside you, so much life, so much light. I remember the first time I saw you cry, not from pain, but because you felt something so deeply that your body didn't know what else to do. That moment told me everything. The world would be harsh on a child like that, but I knew I could help soften the edges." Keanu's voice trembled. He paused, swallowing, then went on. "There are things I never told you, like the day your mother came to me considering sending you to a military boarding school. You were too sensitive, she said, too dreamy. She worried you wouldn't survive the world. I stood in her kitchen and said something I'd never dared say before. What you see as a weakness is his gift, He's not soft. He's tuned in. And if you crush that, you'll never forgive yourself. I risked everything by saying it, but she listened. You stayed, and that boy, my boy, got to grow into the man standing here now. You've never needed to thank me. You did every time you lived with compassion, every time you were kind or patient or real in a world full of masks. I didn't raise you to be famous. I raised you to be good, and you've been more than good. You've been extraordinary. Keanu's voice cracked. He looked down at the letter, tears now falling freely. Olivia moved closer, placing a hand on his back. He continued reading, quieter now. Please don't carry guilt for not finding me sooner. Life moves fast. But I was never far from you, not really. You were always in my prayers, always in my heart. And if this is the end of my story, I want it to be known that I had no regrets. Except that I didn't get to see the boy I loved find peace sooner. But I see it in you now, that peace, that purpose, that goodness. And I rest knowing it's enough. Love always. Lucia. The chapel was silent. No one moved. Keanu folded the letter back into its envelope with trembling hands and kissed the edge of it. She never asked for recognition, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Just for me to be kind in a world that needs it. The funeral ended not with applause, not with speeches, but with a quiet procession of people who had known Lucia in their own quiet way. Caregivers from the facility who'd sat with her during tough nights. Gardeners who'd helped her choose plants for the legacy garden. Children from the shelter who only knew her as Miss Lucia who smiled a lot. Each one left a flower beside her casket, the colors forming a gentle mosaic of lives she'd touched. After the service, Keanu stayed behind with Olivia. The chapel had emptied, and the late afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting soft blues and ambers across the pews. She would have hated all the fuss, Olivia whispered. Keanu gave a soft laugh. She'd be scolding me right now for not eating lunch. They sat together in silence for a while, the letter folded and resting in Keanu's lap. His eyes lingered on the plaque the staff had added to the chapel's back wall. In loving memory of Lucia Alvarez. She gave love quietly and asked nothing in return. I used to think I had to keep moving forward to honor her, Keanu said. Keep working, keep giving, keep pushing. But now I think maybe part of honoring her is knowing when to stop. To feel. Olivia nodded. She'd want that. She didn't want your success. She wanted your peace. He looked up at the window. The sun was low now, casting a long beam across the chapel floor. Dust particles shimmered in its glow, brief, weightless, golden. She gave me everything, he said softly, and I never knew just how much until now. Outside, as they stepped into the fresh evening air, the first star appeared overhead. Olivia looked up. Do you think she's still watching? She asked. Keanu followed her gaze, then nodded. Always. They walked together toward the car, the silence between them filled with memory and meaning. Before climbing in, Keanu turned back once more toward the chapel. He touched the envelope in his coat pocket. Not just a letter, but a map, a compass. A reminder of who he was before the fame, and the person who helped shape him into the man he'd become. As they pulled away from the quiet cemetery, the headlights flicked on, illuminating the road ahead. But Keanu's mind was still with Lucia, in a kitchen long ago, where a quiet boy once learned for the first time what it meant to be seen and to be loved. In the quiet that followed Lucia's funeral, Keanu found himself more reflective than ever. The world around him resumed its usual rhythm, studio meetings, film scripts, scheduled interviews, but something inside him resisted returning to normal. He couldn't just move on, not after everything she had meant, not after the letter, not after what he had read aloud with trembling hands to a room full of people who never really knew the woman who had helped shape him. Each morning he would visit the garden they built together at the children's shelter, the rosemary shrubs she chose for memory, the white lilies she said were for gentle rebirth, and the sunflowers leaning toward the light. Each of them whispered something to him. He would sit on the stone bench by the plaque that bore her words, "For the ones who gave without needing applause," and he would simply listen. But listening wasn't enough anymore. He kept thinking about the millions of women like Lucia, caregivers, who had poured love, patience, and labor into raising other people's children. Many were aging in obscurity, with little support, little thanks. Lucia had made peace with being forgotten, but Keanu couldn't. One evening, he sat in his kitchen, a pot of tea steeping quietly on the stove, and began scribbling thoughts on the back of a folded grocery list. The idea formed slowly but with a clarity that made his hand move faster. A circle, a name, a mission. At the center of the paper, he wrote the words, "The Lucia Initiative." It wouldn't be a charity in the traditional sense. Lucia wouldn't have wanted that. It wouldn't bear his face in commercials, and there would be no press conferences, just help. Quiet, respectful, personal. The fund would provide small grants to elder caregivers, women like Lucia, who had no retirement plans, no savings, no family. It would offer assistance for housing, medical bills, and daily necessities. Not to make headlines, but to restore a piece of dignity that had long been stripped away. Keanu would fund it himself, completely, anonymously. By midnight, he had called his lawyer, his financial advisor, and Claire. She arrived the next morning with legal pads and strong coffee, and they worked in silence, crafting the framework. Keanu wanted privacy safeguards, direct outreach, no complicated forms, no hoops, he said, just answers. By noon, Claire had typed up a first draft of the mission statement, and Keanu added one final line in pen at the bottom. "This is for the ones who showed up, stayed late, and loved without asking for anything in return." Lucia had called him just to hear his voice. Now, he would use that voice for others like her. The Lucia Initiative began quietly. Claire reached out to a few trusted social workers, care agencies, and churches across the country. They were told only that a private benefactor wanted to help retired nannies and long-term caregivers, women over 60 who had cared for others' children and were now struggling in silence. No names were mentioned, no strings attached. Within days, the stories began pouring in. A woman in Baton Rouge who had worked for 4 decades raising children in 3 different households, now living in her car after a medical bill wiped out her savings. A nanny in Detroit who walked with a cane after a hip injury, still cleaning houses because she couldn't afford rent otherwise. A retired caregiver in Bakersfield who'd helped raise 5 children while their parents traveled the world, now bedridden in a rundown apartment with no working heater. Claire reviewed each application personally. Keanu read nearly every one. He didn't need to see faces to know them. Their words were enough, the handwriting, the humility, the reluctance to ask. "I'm not sure if I qualify, but I thought I'd write anyway," became a recurring line in their letters. Some included old Polaroids of the children they once cared for. Others just ended with, "Thank you for remembering people like us." Keanu refused to approve any large checks. Instead, he asked Claire to issue grants in small, life-altering amounts. A few months' rent, a mobility aid, dental work, grocery cards. Every recipient received a handwritten note, never signed with his name, only the phrase, "You are remembered." In a small care facility in Omaha, a woman named Teresa wept when she opened a letter that included a new pair of orthopedic shoes, custom ordered in her size. She'd stopped walking to meals because of the pain. In rural Georgia, a widow named Elsie received a new mattress and a washer-dryer after 12 years of hand-washing clothes in a sink. Her thank you letter arrived written on floral stationery and closed with, "You must be an angel sent through the crack." As the initiative grew, Claire found herself overwhelmed with logistics. That's when Keanu suggested Olivia. Lucia's great-niece had been volunteering at a local shelter and helping organize a community food drive. She had compassion, a calm temperament, and a sharp organizational mind. More importantly, she had lived the legacy. She knew what Lucia stood for. When Keanu asked if she'd considered directing the program full-time, she didn't hesitate. Olivia moved into a modest office space donated by a friend and began building the next phase of the Lucia initiative. She digitized the application process, trained volunteers, and created a quiet national network of elder support that operated without red tape or publicity. Each recipient remained anonymous. No one was turned into a spectacle. It wasn't a headline. It was a heartbeat. Steady, quiet, human. And it was only just beginning. Somewhere in a sunlit Los Angeles office, a corkboard began to fill. Not with accolades or news clippings, but with handwritten letters from across the country. Olivia called it the Wall of Gratitude. Every time a new note arrived, folded in half, sealed with care, always gently worded, she'd tack it to the wall and quietly read it aloud. Most began the same way. "I'm not used to writing letters like this. I didn't expect anyone to remember us. I never thought someone would care." But what followed was extraordinary. "I used to walk 3 miles to the pharmacy because the bus was too expensive. Now I ride with comfort, thanks to the walker you sent. I hadn't seen a dentist in 20 years. I smiled at my granddaughter's graduation last week, unashamed, for the first time in decades. I keep your letter by my bedside. It reminds me that someone knows I existed." Olivia started filing every letter in a hand-bound archive she called the Book of Hands. Each one, she said, was a reminder of the invisible hands that held generations of children. And now, finally, those hands were being held in return. Meanwhile, Keanu kept his distance from the day-to-day operations. But not from the mission. He visited local homes quietly, without cameras. Sometimes he brought food, other times just conversation. He sat in small living rooms, drank instant coffee, and listened to the women who had been overlooked for decades. He didn't introduce himself as a celebrity. He asked questions like, "What brought you joy?" or "What made you proud?" One woman named Beverly, 91, told him she used to sing lullabies in 5 different languages. "The babies didn't care what I sang," she said, "only that someone stayed until they slept." Another, named May, shared a photo of a little boy she had raised for 9 years. "His parents sent me away when he turned 10, she said, "but I never stopped wondering if he was okay." Keanu listened deeply. He never tried to fix their stories. He honored them. And in doing so, he began to heal something in himself, too. Years after Lucia's passing, her name had become more than a memory. It had become a movement. Not one built on recognition, but on restoration. Not fame, but quiet dignity. Olivia often said, "We don't spotlight these women, we steady them." The fund grew slowly, not because of promotion, but because word spread through communities. Churches, nursing homes, libraries, a friend telling a friend. One day, Keanu received a letter written in Spanish. It ended with a simple line. "Because you remembered her, now someone remembered me." He placed it beside Lucia's final letter. Then, he whispered the same thing he had said at her bedside. "I didn't forget you." And now the world wouldn't either. The building stood on a quiet street in Toronto, wrapped in a soft spring breeze and the scent of nearby cherry blossoms. What had once been Keanu Reeves' childhood home was now something very different. Yet, in many ways, it had come full circle. Keanu stepped out of a modest black SUV and stood at the sidewalk, looking up at the familiar structure. The outside had been restored with care, white-painted brick, clean steps, and a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "The Bright Path Learning Center." He hadn't visited in years, but today wasn't about memory. It was about tribute. The nonprofit had taken over the property last year, with Keanu's quiet funding behind the scenes. Its mission was simple: to support underprivileged children with tutoring, emotional support, and a safe place to dream. But today, the ribbon was being cut on something more personal. A new wing inside the center, named not for a celebrity or donor, but for a woman the world had only recently learned to know. Claire met him at the entrance with a gentle nod. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The air already carried the weight of memory. Inside, laughter echoed faintly, the hum of learning. Children moving between art tables and beanbags, brightly colored posters lining the walls. But Keanu's steps moved in one direction only, to the hallway off the main room, where a fresh sign had just been mounted. The Lucia Alvarez Learning Room. He stood in front of the plaque for a moment, his hand gently brushing the edge. Below her name was a single line in script. She believed in one child, and that changed everything. Behind him, Olivia walked slowly, carrying a folder filled with thank you letters from the children already enrolled here. But she paused beside him, reading the words in silence. Her fingers tightened around the papers. She would have said it was too much, Olivia whispered. Keanu gave a quiet smile, which is why we had to do it. The door creaked open. Inside, soft golden light poured in through wide windows. The room smelled faintly of crayons, wood, and something else. Lavender, maybe, like the kind Lucia used to put in the laundry. Rows of bookshelves lined the walls. One corner held oversized pillows for reading, and another was devoted to blocks and dress-up costumes. But at the very center of the room was a handmade rug. It was round, large enough for 10 children to sit in a circle, with a swirling pattern of stars and vines stitched in colored yarn. Olivia knelt beside it. "She sewed this," she said quietly, "by hand. I found it in her storage trunk." Keanu swallowed hard. The edges were frayed, the blue had faded, but it was unmistakably hers. She'd made it for him when he was 6. Back then, he'd used it to pretend he was in a castle, protecting a kingdom from dragons. Now it was a gathering place for young imaginations, just as she'd always wanted. Olivia touched the fabric gently. She'd be proud. He nodded, his voice tight. A small crowd of volunteers, teachers, and community leaders had gathered in the hallway now, waiting respectfully just outside the doorway. Many of them had only recently learned who Lucia Alvarez truly was. To them, she'd gone from a quiet caregiver in a photograph to something much more, a symbol of unseen sacrifice and quiet love that changed the course of a boy's life. Keanu took a few steps into the room. Near the windowsill, a framed display caught his eye. He knelt beside it. Inside the glass were 3 items: a faded photograph of Lucia, with young Keanu sitting beside her on the porch steps, a copy of the children's book she used to read to him, The Secret Garden, and a small note she had once written in Spanish. "Cada niño merece ser visto." Every child deserves to be seen. It stopped him cold. Those words had once been spoken quietly in a kitchen, while she folded his socks and wiped crumbs from the floor. And now here they were, etched forever, above the heads of children she would never meet, but whose lives she would still shape. He stood slowly as a teacher entered with a small group of kids, maybe 6 or 7 in total, ranging from kindergarten age to 10. The teacher smiled. "Would it be okay if they play for a while?" Keanu stepped aside, gesturing gently. "Please, that's what it's for." The children hesitated at first, sensing the importance of the moment. Then one little girl skipped onto the rug and dropped onto her knees, pulling a puzzle from the nearby bin. The others followed, building towers, flipping through picture books, sharing crayons. And just like that, the room came alive. Keanu watched in silence, arms folded. He wasn't thinking about movie sets or awards or fame, only about the fact that one person's belief, Lucia's faith in him, had turned this moment into a reality. A volunteer approached Olivia and handed her a tablet. "You need to see this," she whispered. Olivia opened the screen and saw a message thread filling fast. Pictures from across the country, from small schools and libraries sending their support after reading about Lucia, a teacher in Alabama who used the article for a lesson on kindness, a school librarian in Vermont who had added the Lucia Room to their quiet reading corner, and one video just posted of a little boy in Texas reading aloud, "She believed in one child." Keanu turned as Olivia handed him the tablet. "Ise came in this morning," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Lucia didn't just change your life. She's changing hundreds." Keanu stared at the screen for a long moment. "She never wanted recognition," he said quietly. Olivia nodded. "That's why it means so much now." He glanced back at the rug, at the books, at the sunlight falling gently across the faces of the children playing. Lucia would have never walked into a room like this, expecting her name on the door. But she would have sat down beside a child, handed them a storybook, and stayed long enough for them to feel safe. And now, because of her, they always would. The observatory sat quietly atop a hill just outside Los Angeles, far enough from the city lights to see the stars, close enough to feel their weight. On this particular evening, the sky was clear, velvety, and infinite, exactly as Keanu had hoped. He stood in the entryway beside Olivia, both bundled against the cool spring air. She looked over at him, eyes filled with a mix of anticipation and gentle confusion. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "She always told me to look up when I was scared," he said, voice soft. "Now I just want to give her a reason to be looked up to." They stepped inside. The observatory's interior smelled of books, metal, and history. An elderly astronomer named Dr. Peter Rinaldi greeted them warmly. He had spent over 5 decades studying the skies, cataloging stars, and helping people name celestial bodies through official registries. But this request, this one, he'd told Keanu, was different. "I've never seen someone so certain," Rinaldi had said when Keanu reached out. "You knew exactly which star you wanted. Most folks just pick a bright one." Keanu nodded now as the three of them walked deeper into the observatory dome. "She wasn't loud," he said, "but she never faded." Rinaldi flipped a switch, and the massive dome above them began to rotate slowly, the telescope aligning with a point of light billions of miles away. "I've got it centered," he said. "This one, cataloged as HD 1034,563, is yours now, and we've submitted the official paperwork to the International Star Registry. It's been renamed Lucia Alvarez." Olivia's hand flew to her mouth. She stepped forward, peering through the lens, with tears already welling in her eyes. "It's so steady," she whispered. "She was," Keanu replied. "Always." Rinaldi dimmed the lights further. A projection of the star's coordinates lit up a nearby wall. Beneath it was a certificate, carefully framed, ready for presentation. Keanu took it in his hands and looked at the inscription. "Lucia Alvarez, in eternal gratitude for the light she gave." He stood silently for a moment, staring not just at the name, but at the space between the words. In the quiet, he imagined Lucia's voice, its comforting cadence, the way it had once read him bedtime stories when his parents had been too preoccupied to notice he'd been crying, the way she had hummed lullabies in Spanish while folding laundry, the way she had believed in him when he'd barely known what he believed in himself. "You know," Keanu said after a long pause, "the first story she ever told me was about stars. She said they were ancient souls watching over us. I didn't believe her at the time." "And now?" Olivia asked, wiping her cheek. "I don't know if I believe they're souls," he said, "but I know hers deserves to shine like one." The small presentation room beside the dome had been quietly prepared. On the far wall, a framed photo of Lucia sat atop a black velvet stand, beside a single blooming rose in a glass vase. A few close friends from the care facility had made the trip, along with the observatory staff, who had quickly grown emotional as they learned about the woman behind the star. Keanu took a seat beside Olivia, the certificate now placed in a wooden case lined with soft cream fabric. His hands were folded in his lap, but his mind was drifting backward again, to a time when he was maybe 7, sitting beside Lucia in the backyard of their old Toronto house. His knees scraped, his eyes puffy from tears after another rough day at school. That night she had pulled out a flashlight and pointed it toward the sky, making shapes with the beam between the stars. "You see that one, Mignon?" she had said, drawing a wide circle around a patch of glittering light. That one is yours. You look at it when you're lost. You look at it when you feel alone. It won't leave you. He hadn't understood then, but tonight he did. Dr. Rinaldi stepped forward. We often talk about how stars are born from clouds of dust and gas, he said. But the truth is, many stars live quiet lives. They burn steadily, never flaring, never fading, just shining. And often, those are the ones that last the longest. He turned toward Keanu and Olivia. I think that's what Lucia was. Keanu nodded, unable to speak. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something small, worn but still whole. It was a fabric rose, faded pink, hand-sewn with tiny green thread leaves, the petals just slightly frayed with age. Lucia had made it for him when he was 10. He'd kept it in a book for decades. He placed it at the base of the framed star certificate and whispered, "This is where it belongs." Olivia rested her head lightly on his shoulder. They sat in the soft hush of the observatory for what felt like a long time, the quiet broken only by the occasional beep of a telescope adjustment or the low murmur of conversation in the hallway. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rattling a few leaves against the windows. The sky remained clear. Lucia's star held steady. "You know," Olivia said after a long pause, "it's strange. I used to think my great-aunt had a simple life. No marriage, no big job, no kids of her own, just years of working for other families." "She had a legacy," Keanu replied. "Not many people do." He stood and looked through the telescope one more time, hands clasped behind his back. "Every time I got a role, every time I walked on a set, she was there with me. Not literally, but inside. That's who she was." Olivia joined him at the window, eyes lifted to the stars. "You think she knows?" she asked softly. Keanu didn't answer right away. Then, after a moment, he said, "I think she always did." The sky blinked back in silence. And overhead, nestled in a small constellation just left of the Milky Way's bright stream, the star named Lucia Alvarez shimmered gently. Quiet, unwavering, eternal. The garden was still. Early morning mist hovered just above the flower beds, and the dew made each leaf shimmer like it had its own heartbeat. The bench sat beneath an old cedar, its wood freshly sealed, the metal plaque secured to the backrest with quiet dignity. It read simply, "In memory of Lucia Alvarez, she believed in just one child." And that changed everything. Keanu stood in front of it with a single rose in his hand. No press, no cameras, just him, the silence, and the sound of wind threading through trees. He placed the rose gently on the bench, paused, then sat beside it, staring ahead. The sunlight was just beginning to reach the edges of the path, warming the stone that lined the little walking trail behind the children's center. Across the way, laughter was beginning to rise from the playroom. A new group of preschoolers had arrived that week. He could see them through the window, running, rolling, building small cities from plastic blocks, and sharing snacks on the rug Lucia had once sewn by hand. Her legacy lived in more than bricks and benches. It lived in the rhythm of care, in the programs that now supported elder caregivers, in the star that bore her name, and in the way Olivia walked, with quiet strength, purpose, and the kind of heart that saw the overlooked. That's what Lucia had taught him, not just kindness, but attention, the discipline of noticing the quiet ones, the practice of showing up when no one else did. Claire had told him once that the best stories were the ones whispered. He hadn't understood then, but now he did. In the weeks since the star had been named and the garden dedicated, the Lucia initiative had gained quiet momentum. Hundreds of letters poured in, some handwritten, some emailed, some left in small donation boxes at community centers across the country. "Thank you for seeing us. I was a nanny for 42 years. I never thought anyone would care. This made me feel like I mattered. My grandmother raised me. This reminded me of her." Some included old photos. Others included pressed flowers. One came with a tiny sweater someone had knitted decades ago, and kept all this time. A few had no names at all, just folded sheets with tear stains. Olivia, now officially the director of the program, kept a binder filled with every single one. Keanu rarely spoke publicly about the project. He let the work speak for itself. Grants were distributed quietly, housing was arranged behind the scenes, medical care delivered with no fanfare. He'd asked that the name Lucia Alvarez only appear on internal documentation and plaques, not headlines. That was how she would have wanted it. But every now and then, someone would recognize her name on a resource list or a care package, and sometimes they'd whisper a question. Wasn't that the woman who once raised? He never confirmed, but he never denied it either. Lucia's story had moved people not because it was glamorous, but because it was true, honest, unfiltered. It reminded the world that the most powerful influences often come without a spotlight. One morning, Keanu found a note taped to the front gate of the literacy center. It was folded in half, scrawled in a child's handwriting. To the lady who helped the man who helps us. It made him stop and sit on the curb for a while, heart aching in a way that only gratitude could bring. He could still hear her voice. Gentle, measured, laughing even when things were hard. She used to hum old lullabies in Spanish while folding laundry or stirring soup. She once told him that kindness wasn't weakness, it was courage worn quietly. And when he was 14 and broken from the weight of being different, she hadn't tried to fix him. She just sat beside him on the floor until he found the strength to speak. Her absence hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that felt earned. A love so big it had stretched through decades, and now, even in her passing, it held him together. That morning, before leaving the garden, Keanu took a deep breath and said the words he had written months ago. Words meant for her, for the world, and for anyone who had ever been lifted by someone who asked for nothing in return. Sometimes the people who shape us most leave no footprints on fame, but they leave fingerprints on our soul. Lucia believed when no one else did. That's the kind of hero who never dies. He stood up slowly and gave the bench one last look. Then he walked toward the building where Olivia was waiting to begin their meeting with a new group of caregivers. Another story, another unseen hand, another life shaped by quiet strength. And for everyone watching, everyone who felt this story, who carried their own Lucia in their memory, he had only one request. If someone helped shape your life, share this incredible story in their honor. Tell us in the comments, who's the Lucia in your life? Because behind every success, there's often a quiet voice in the background. Who made all the difference?